Atlantis is not a real place.
Does Atlantis come well before?
Truth is always hidden. Atlantis was destroyed. It just mysteriously disappeared and ended.
Way of Will Jon.
Does Atlantis come well before? Or does this supposedly, when people are talking about the literal Atlantis, would this have been that time before? After? I think we are to you, Jon.
I cannot answer that question, Will, can I?
You have to answer this question in the way that tells
Jon.
us what you believe the Atlantis myth is.
So, to me, Atlantis is not a real place. There's no evidence for it that I am aware of. It is just an allegory of the state of Egyptian society versus Greek society. That's how I look at it. Many people assume it happened post-Younger Dryas period or around that, especially Mr. H, we're calling him. I don't want to give him any more credit than that. If this gets transcript, he believes that the Younger Dryas period caused mass flooding. If he doesn't say the Younger Dryas period, he'll talk about melt pulse waters. I won't go into the Younger Dryas yet until you're ready, but that's my view, is that Atlantis would have happened post-Younger Dryas, but not far afterwards.
Okay. Before you answer that, Matt, could we get just a proper understanding of the story and how we have the story of Atlantis? I don't know which one of you would feel more adept to tell that. Could you tell us?
Go ahead, Jon.
Where we have this story from and what it is.
There isn't much to say at all about it, really. Solon goes to Egypt. A line that's mentioned, I think it's literally one line in Herodotus' histories. Solon went on his travels, went to Egypt. It doesn't give us too much information. It's the fact that Hancock grasps onto Solon visiting Egypt, and the Times talked about that he tried to come up with this period.
Traditional story is Solon is the first Westerner that visits Egypt in a very, very, very long time, before the memory of essentially the Western world. And he visits Egypt and he goes to an island right off of Alexandria, a place that's no longer there, and there's a temple on it called the Temple of Sais, S-A-I-S. And the Temple of Sais, and this is, of course, very extensively discussed by my good friend Randall Carlson as well as Graham Hancock, but it's discussed how the Temple of Sais, the entire purpose of it was to be a catalog of ancient history, and that its purpose was a temple that recorded the ancient past. That's what they state, and that on the walls there was the stories of our ancestors and our ancient past long before we remember it. And that was what legend has it that the actual temple contained. Now, do we have any verification on that other than that story? No. But what we know is that Solon met with a very specific elder priest named Sanchez. And Sanchez was a head elder priest of these ancient Egyptian mysteries. And according to him, he was the only one left alive that even knew the full story. He was like the elder priest of that kind of memory. And there was other priests with him. But he told Solon, you Greeks remember only one deluge, but there have been many. Primarily of water and fire, he says. And he goes on to describe different aspects. My opinion, Jon, is that the reason why Plato created all the allegories around it. Imagine your great mentor teacher, Socrates, taught you everything you know. Imagine he's murdered right in front of you, poisoned, because he's speaking out. Would you then write down the story of Atlantis in just a very literal way and be like, I'm not too worried about it, guys. Let's put this out there and see how it does. Plato wouldn't be here. Plato would have gotten killed. Plato would have gotten murdered. So my theory here is that the reason why Plato created allegories around this, number one, the knowledge would have got him he would have died from blasphemy against the church and all these different things. But also, there's this concept woven throughout history from sages and mystics, and this idea that truth is always hidden within allegory so that only those who are initiates can understand it. So there's this idea that you can't just give the knowledge of the ancients and knowledge of all of these things that make up more divine things. Just you can't hand it out because it can end up in the hands of the wrong kind of individuals. And so one of the things we find throughout history, whether or not it's Hermetic texts or Mesopotamian texts, or like we're talking about right now, like Plato's text, is that they're all hidden within allegory. And it's interesting to see and wonder why they did that. And again, I think it's because it's for initiates that can understand and see and understand symbolism. Like Manly P. Hall said, once the truth and the understanding of symbolism and is understood by essentially the masses, a great veil will be lifted from society, because it's a way to protect a message so that only those who can understand it. Now, the interesting thing about that story, though, is that Plato says that Atlantis was destroyed. If you study ice cores and you study the climatic data from the Younger Dryas, you learn that at 11,600 years ago, you had the very end, the terminus, what's called the terminus of the Younger Dryas, meaning that we find the most volatility and temperature gradients, CO2, as well as climatic and disruptive Earth events at that exact date. Now, the other thing to add on is very interesting that if you look at the descriptions of where Plato says Atlantis is, he talks about it being west of the Pillars of Hercules, in this area of the world that today very much aligns with the Azores. Now, Randall Carlson, who I've had extensive conversations about, who's a very good geologist, likes to point out that the Azores also happens to be the best example of a submerged continent that we have still today. Where if you look at a satellite image of the Azores in the Atlantic Ocean, you'll see that number one, it falls on 3 different plate boundaries, one of the most volatile areas of the world, but also it has a massive sunken plateau of land that is still relatively shallow compared to all the oceans around it. And it looks like, and geologically can speak to the idea that an actual tectonic event can subduct an entire piece of land. It can literally sink into the ocean. And we have seen that. We know that Earth's history is violent, but that's from millions of years ago. I'm not confusing that with more current times. We're just simply pointing out, look, different parts of the Earth and different time periods can have disastrous tectonic effects and extreme events. Now, geologists are going to tell us that all Earth's history is based on gradualism. Okay, now I'm a pretty well self-trained geology guy and climatologist guy who studies it for well over a decade, and I can tell you that that is true in most cases. Most of these huge events we're looking at in mountain building events did happen during a gradualism, meaning over time. However, there looks like there have been specific times in history, usually related to getting out of a glacial cycle during an interglacial cycle, when it looks like you get massive disruptions to the magnetosphere of the Earth, the poles, moving different things around, causing what I believe, based on a man named Hapgood, is called Earth crust displacement. If you think about the tectonic plates moving around, and generally they move very slowly and you get like a little earthquake as it kind of bumps up against it, right? Now let's imagine an actual event where the entire Earth gets disrupted based on the weight of ice on land masses, as well as coronal mass ejections and sun activity that are disrupting the magnetic poles. If you get a disruption significant enough and you start having entire movements of tectonic activity that are slipping and moving and diving under one another during these periods of time, it helps explain how you could get absolutely massive events around the Earth. Massive, to the point where you could have enough happen to completely wipe out an entire chapter of human civilization. I believe Atlantis was from a completely lost time period of our history that we forgot all of it. We forgot the sophistication of the building. We lost our understanding of the divine concepts of the earth and the heavens and the cosmos and balance and all of these very fundamental things. And we almost became like reset. And then we had to get back to that point.
Yes, there are geological events on the Earth that can wipe out masses of land. We've seen that. The one I'm more familiar with recently is the removal pretty much of the whole of Doggerland, which was the land mass between Great Britain and Europe, with an underwater sort of landslide, in effect, which created a tsunami that literally wiped out a majority of the land between what was left of the land anyway, between Britain and Europe. So, yes, absolutely familiar with that. It doesn't mean I can conjure something up that explains Atlantis, though. I mean, I'd look for geologists to come at that. But as I say, everything I have read from people in peer-reviewed papers and academically suggests this wasn't the case. In terms of the Younger Dryas, and so the view is with this terminal event, Will, is that the world suddenly became cold and became hot again over 1,000 years. In 1,000 years, suddenly cold, 1,000 years later, back to normal and actually rising. And there's all sorts of theories for that. Probably the most popular one is a comet burst in the atmosphere in the northern hemisphere, because the Younger Dryas event doesn't seem to have affected the whole planet, predominantly the northern hemisphere of the planet.
That's where the megafauna die-offs were, primarily.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
What about the ice, though? The water locked up into ice during the last ice age with the Laurentide ice sheet. What about putting that into understanding for the volume of water on the Earth versus having a lot of it?
The increase, yes, sea levels go up. As I say, sea levels went up 40 metres between 14 and 10,000 years ago. 40 metres, 120, 130 feet. That's a lot of sea level. But if you look at it, it's like a centimetre a year or something on average. So, I mean, there would be years where it went up a lot more, but again, there's nothing significant. Plus, also, as you say, is that the weight of the ice on land also pushed land down. So we actually see sea level drops in some places as land rises back again. So you can't just measure it based on where the sea level is now, sort of thing. There is just a geographic movement, and I get that. From my aspect of myth making, the knowledge we have on myth dispersal is incredible. As I say, I have literally 50,000 items of data I look at, across 1,100 editions of 1,100 odd locations. We see how myths disperse. We see a clear pattern that myths come out of Africa, go into Asia, across Europe, into North America, down into South America, as well as some go to Australia, and then another burst from probably, near Armenia, which will please you, and Turkey, again, probably just post Younger Dryas, where there's a burst of new myth and belief coming out of that place. Now that is rather interesting. Why does that happen? And that primarily happens because of the use of pastoral farming, I believe, and the invention of horse riding, and the invention of the wheel, which was in Eastern Europe, according to more recent studies in the last 10 years, which created the horse and cart. And once you've got a horse and cart and a war chariot, the war chariot within 500 years, the knowledge of that spread thousands of miles. It was a game changer in terms of civilization. So to me, that is how I see the world. One
of the areas that I'm interested to get Jon's feedback on is, so I've studied megalithic civilizations for a long, long time. The architecture, the specific way that they designed them. One of the fascinating concepts, and I want to get Jon's opinion on this, is that when we look at what we call grand civilizations that built amazing things, accomplished incredible things, when we look at them around the world, places where they built giant things. Let's give you an example, like the Moai of Easter Island, right? The pre-Rapa Nui culture, as I'm going to call it. Or go look at Egypt in Aswan with the unfinished obelisk. Or go to Baalbek, Lebanon with the giant stone of the pregnant woman and the other ones that are still in the quarry. Or go to the Yangshan quarry in China, okay? What do all those things have in common? All of those locations are part of grand civilizations that created incredible things. High capabilities to make amazing things. The problem is, though, every one of those examples I gave you, every time, whether it's the Moai or the unfinished obelisk or in Baalbek, Lebanon with the giant blocks, or in Yangshan Quarry, every single of those examples, that culture had taken on the largest possible projects they had ever taken on, okay? Every case, like give an example, the Moai statue that never made it out of the quarry was like 3 times the size of any Moai that they had existing. And the obelisk in Egypt, in Aswan, would have been more than double the size of any obelisk that existed. Same thing for Baalbek, Lebanon, same thing for Yangshan. A lot of people would say and jump on saying, well, it's because they tried to make something too big and they couldn't do it, so they abandoned the project. Or an earthquake cracked it, so they gave up on it. Here's the thing that's interesting. How would that be the case all around the world, completely different points, right? Where they're all taking on the largest projects they possibly did. Now, why would you do that? Well, you would do that because your civilization's the highest level it had possibly gotten to. So you want to create the most grand things possible. So then, how is it possible that all of those locations, all of the largest things they ever built, never made it out, and that civilization seemed to have been destroyed right after that point, or they just disappeared? Because there are no blocks that big anywhere else. But furthermore, those areas where they found those large stones were the most recent thing that they had worked on. So it wasn't like they were like in the back somewhere. They're like, yeah, remember that? We tried to do that. That was a bad idea. No, it's not. It's not like that. It seems like they were all taking on these grand projects, and then around the world, it all stopped. It just mysteriously disappeared and ended. Now, I want to add one more thing. We're working with Robert Schoch right now, a famous geologist who talks all about coronal mass ejections and damage on the Earth. And one of the things that's very attractive that we're exploring is a site called 𝗃𝗪𝗟𝗡 in Turkey, on the northwest side of Lake Van. When I just got a chance to visit there in May, what I photographed was at least 24 basalt blocks that had massive vitrification on them. I mean, completely melted across the top, where in some cases we actually had obsidian glass that had formed out of these events, and the blocks were strewn. The largest blocks at 𝗃𝗪𝗟𝗡 was between 10 and 20 tons, had tumbled down the mountain hundreds of feet and had landed down on the side of the hill, and across the top of it had massive melting and vitrification on it, as well as the huge artifact I call the Kef box relief that came from that had made its way all the way down to a town called the Gigeves, which was more than half a mile or a mile down the mountain into this town. What kind of an event, okay, could have created those types of disastrous effects on these stones? Whereas in recent memory, when we look at the last 10,000 years, we don't see any major events that were like that, but we do during the Younger Dryas, which gives us this more comprehensive look at saying, well, we know the Younger Dryas had extreme heat effects, whether that was from an impact or some kind of coronal mass ejection. We know that it created a layer around the world of basically like fires and melting and burning. We see that, and we see these stones that are completely melted and from an event. So does that give us justification to say that they were built before the Younger Dryas?